A billionaire lies in a hospital suite surrounded by 20 of the nation's finest doctors, yet none of them can explain why his body is failing. Machines hum, charts fill with confusion, and every passing hour pulls him closer to the edge. What none of them expect is that the key to saving him isn't written in their textbooks but carried silently by someone they never even noticed. For years she walked those same halls unseen, pushing a cart, mopping floors, dismissed as background noise. What her colleagues never realized was that her mind, once destined for science, still burned with knowledge. When the signs appeared, fingernails discolored, hair falling in a peculiar pattern, a metallic trace lingering in the air, she connected them into a picture everyone else ignored. Her courage to act would change everything. The luxury wing of Street Mark's medical center looked more like a five-star hotel than a hospital. Mahogany panels hid medical equipment, velvet curtains softened the light, and art hung on the walls as if illness could be disguised by wealth. Caldwell had demanded nothing less. For decades, he believed money could fix any problem, silence any enemy, and buy the sharpest minds. Yet here, his fortune meant nothing. Each day, his condition deteriorated. His hair fell out in strands, his fingernails turned an unhealthy yellow, and his gums carried a bluish discoloration that even makeup could not hide. His once booming voice had shrunk to a whisper, his presence no longer commanding boardrooms, but barely commanding his own breath. The doctors gathered daily in hushed conferences. Neurologists spoke of degenerative disease, hepatologists suggested rare liver disorders, and toxicologists offered nothing conclusive. Every test returned confusing results. Each theory was contradicted by another. They scribbled notes, ordered more scans, requested more panels, but their words betrayed the truth they were grasping at shadows. Outside Caldwell's room, the air carried a mixture of cologne, antiseptic, and something metallic, though no one seemed to notice. No one, except Clara Johnson. Clara pushed her cleaning cart into the room as she had done every night since the billionaire's admission. At 40 years old, she had long grown used to invisibility. As a black janitor, she blended into the background of the hospital, her uniform an unofficial cloak of dismissal. People spoke freely in front of her, dismissed her presence, and at best, offered a polite nod when she passed. But Clara's eyes missed nothing. She had once been a brilliant chemistry student with a scholarship that promised a future in toxicology. Professors admired her focus, her way of connecting patterns others overlooked, her ability to see not just the obvious but the hidden. Life, however, had been merciless. When her parents were killed in an accident, Clara left school to raise 3 younger siblings. Her dreams turned into bills, her textbooks turned into extra shifts, and the promising future shrank into a mop, a cart, and a uniform that rendered her unseen. Still, the knowledge never left her. She read journals during lunch breaks, borrowed library books, and absorbed online lectures in stolen moments. It was not a degree she carried anymore, but a mind sharpened by both training and hardship. Tonight, that mind stirred violently as she noticed Caldwell's failing body. She paused by the bed, eyes drifting over his chart carelessly left in plain view by a distracted resident. Peripheral neuropathy, alopecia, digestive issues. The list leapt at her like puzzle pieces demanding to be fitted. She steadied herself, recalling long ago lectures about poisons that mimicked multiple diseases at once. Thallium. The word pulsed in her brain. Alopecia and neuropathy together, coupled with organ decline, pointed to it almost perfectly. Her mop paused in midair, her heart racing. Could the doctors truly not see this? Clara's gaze shifted to the nightstand where an elegant jar of imported hand cream sat prominently. She remembered seeing it yesterday, and the day before, always placed in the same deliberate position. She had once glimpsed Henry Whitman, Caldwell's longtime rival turned supposed friend, bringing it in with practiced ease. He insisted it was Caldwell's favorite, that it soothed his skin, that it was the only brand he would use. Clara's instincts flared. The cream, the symptoms, the pattern, they aligned too perfectly. She inhaled, and there it was again, that faint metallic scent beneath the cologne and antiseptic. She glanced around. The doctors huddled across the room, voices tense, faces drawn. "We must consider autoimmune causes," Dr. William Hargrove declared, his silver hair gleaming under the artificial light. "His decline does not follow any ordinary pathway." The younger physicians nodded, their faces uncertain, but none challenged him. To them, Clara did not exist. To them, She was part of the furniture, a background detail. She lowered her gaze, pressing her mop to the floor, but her mind was alive with connections they had missed. Caldwell groaned faintly in his sleep, his hand twitching against the sheets. Clara's chest tightened. He was dying in front of them, and they were blind. The tragedy of it all pressed against her ribs, 20 doctors with walls full of diplomas, and none of them saw what a janitor with a forgotten education could see. She longed to speak, to cry out the truth that blazed in her mind, but she knew the response. They would laugh. They would dismiss her. They would remind her of her uniform. She remembered the last time she had tried to offer an opinion, years earlier, when she mentioned a possible chemical cause of a patient's unusual rash. The nurse had sneered, "Stick to the floors." That humiliation had kept her silent for years, yet now silence tasted unbearable. As she wheeled her cart out of Caldwell's suite, Clara caught her reflection in the glass door. Tired eyes, worn face, uniform neat but unremarkable. Richard Caldwell was dying, and she was the only one who had seen the pattern clearly. The hospital staff bustled around her, white coats flowing, clipboards snapping shut, stethoscopes swinging, but no one looked at her. She moved like a shadow, pushing her cart through the corridors, invisible in plain sight. Invisibility had been the story of her life. As a black woman working a janitorial job, her presence had always been reduced to the sound of a mop against tile, the smell of disinfectant trailing behind her, the nod of recognition only when someone needed her to clean a spill. Yet invisibility had sharpened her eyes. She noticed details others ignored, patterns others dismissed, behaviors others glossed over. Years ago, professors had praised her for this ability, telling her she had a mind built for scientific inquiry. But after her parents' accident forced her to quit school, she had been forced into survival mode, working long hours to feed her siblings, her textbooks boxed away, and her scholarship rescinded. That part of her life felt like another person's story, yet her mind never stopped working like a scientist. It was why she saw Richard Caldwell differently from the others. Tonight, as she slipped into his suite, the air felt even heavier than before. Caldwell lay motionless, his chest rising shallowly under expensive silk sheets. His skin carried an unhealthy pallor, and when he stirred, Clara saw the tremor in his hands. The monitors by his bed beeped with grim regularity, their sounds echoing against the lavish wood panels that pretended this was a hotel room. Around him stood Dr. William Hargrove and his team, their faces furrowed, their voices clipped. "His liver functions are declining faster than expected," one specialist reported. "Neurological damage is advancing," another added. Hargrove raised a hand, silencing them. "We need to consider more exotic conditions," he said. "It may be autoimmune, perhaps a cascade triggered by something undetected. We will broaden the panels." Clara lowered her gaze and polished a table, but her ears caught every word. She felt the sting of dismissal all over again. They spoke as though their authority alone would pull the answer from thin air. None of them looked at the discoloration on Caldwell's gums or the way his nails seemed to yellow in a precise pattern. None of them acknowledged the metallic scent lingering in the air. None of them even noticed the expensive jar of cream placed carefully on the nightstand, its cap gleaming under the light. Clara noticed. She had noticed it every day. And tonight, she noticed something else. The jar was not exactly where it had been yesterday. Someone had moved it. The hand cream was no ordinary gift, she thought. It was positioned too carefully, introduced too deliberately. Her instincts screamed at her that this jar was part of the story no one else was willing to write. Still, she said nothing. If she spoke, she knew how it would play out. Dr. Hargrove would sneer, the nurses would snicker, and security would be called if she pressed too far. But silence weighed on her chest. She wanted to scream the word burning in her mind: thallium. Instead, she continued her routine, cleaning surfaces with steady, practiced strokes, her expression neutral. She became furniture, wallpaper, a fixture in the room. Yet her mind whirred as she assembled evidence in silence. After the doctors dispersed, she lingered a moment longer, her eyes darting across Caldwell's chart. Neuropathy, alopecia, gastrointestinal pain. It was all there, written in careful medical handwriting, yet no one connected the symptoms. They treated each in isolation, chasing autoimmune shadows, ignoring the clear outline forming in front of them. Clara remembered her toxicology professor warning about poisons that mimicked multiple illnesses. Thallium had been called the perfect poison, undetectable without specific tests, a killer that mocked medicine by scattering clues across the body. She shivered, her mop handle cool against her hands. Could she really be the only one seeing this? As she left the room, she overheard two younger residents speaking in the hallway. "Strangest progression I've ever seen," one muttered. "Like multiple diseases at once. Reynolds thinks it's autoimmune," the other replied. "But none of the tests make sense. It's inconsistent." Clara paused, hidden by the angle of the hallway, her heart pounding. Their words confirmed her suspicion. They knew something was wrong but lacked the courage to challenge their superior. She thought of Caldwell lying in that suite, the richest man in the building yet powerless against what crept through his body. Money could buy luxury curtains and elite doctors, but it could not buy the truth if no one looked for it. Clara clenched her jaw. She had spent her entire adult life being ignored, working thankless shifts, carrying knowledge in silence. She had accepted invisibility as her fate, but now that invisibility might become her strength. She saw what they missed because no one expected her to see at all. She pushed her cart toward the supply room, her reflection catching in the polished floor tiles. For years, she had been reduced to this reflection, a tired woman in a uniform, bent shoulders, eyes lowered. But tonight, as the thought of thallium thundered in her mind, she straightened. The image of Richard Caldwell's pale face, the discoloration of his gums, the tremor in his hands, and the glint of the imported hand cream would not leave her mind. She had lain awake the previous night thinking of thallium, replaying lectures from her university days, remembering diagrams of heavy metal poisoning, recalling the professor who warned that thallium was the silent killer because its symptoms mimicked dozens of other conditions, and she could not shake the certainty that this was what was consuming the Tycoon. She felt it in her bones, and tonight she expected to see more evidence that her suspicions were correct. When she entered Caldwell's room, the suite looked as polished as ever, but the atmosphere carried a heavy dread. Caldwell's condition had worsened, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy, his eyes closed in exhaustion. Machines beeped steadily, but every sound seemed to announce his decline. Nurses worked quietly, checking his IV, wiping his forehead, adjusting monitors, but the true authority entered minutes later with a visitor who carried himself like he belonged to a world of boardrooms and power. Clara had seen him before, a tall man with slicked hair, sharp eyes, and a tailored suit that fit like armor. His badge read Henry Whitman, and his name alone carried weight. Once Caldwell's fiercest rival in business, Whitman had reinvented himself as the supportive friend during illness, a figure who appeared with practiced concern and expensive gifts. Today he carried an elegant black jar in his hand. "Imported from Switzerland," he said smoothly to Dr. Hargrove as he set it down on the nightstand. "It's the only hand cream Richard tolerates. He insists it soothes him. I brought another jar so he won't be without it." His voice was calm, deliberate, almost too deliberate, and Clara froze in her corner of the room, polishing a surface while listening. She watched the jar carefully as he placed it with such precision, ensuring it was positioned prominently, impossible to ignore. Nurses nodded politely, one even remarking that she would apply it to Caldwell's hands later for comfort. Clara's stomach tightened, her instincts flaring. The careful placement, the insistent tone, the repeated gift, it all felt rehearsed. She thought of the metallic scent she had noticed before, the sheen on the cream surface, and the sudden declines in Caldwell's health that seemed to follow Whitman's visits. The jar was not a gift. It was a weapon. Clara's mop bucket squeaked softly as she shifted, drawing no attention, for Whitman and the doctors never looked at her. They spoke of liver functions, neurological decline, and experimental treatments, but Clara's eyes stayed locked on the cream, every detail screaming at her that this was the delivery system. When Whitman finally left, shaking hands with Hargrove and nodding to the nurses with manufactured sympathy, Clara remained behind, studying the jar as she wiped the counter near it. She dared not touch it directly, but she leaned closer, catching the faint metallic note once again. She whispered under her breath, "It's here! I know it's here!" That evening, while cleaning another wing, Clara overheard two residents whispering about Caldwell's case. "It's like he has 5 diseases at once," one said, frustration evident. "Every test contradicts the last. It's maddening." "Hargrove says autoimmune," the other replied. "But nothing lines up. The timing is strange too. Some days he crashes, some days he stabilizes, like something external is driving it. Clara's heart raced. Something external. Yes, she thought, something applied to his skin daily, disguised as a harmless luxury. She knew now with certainty that the jar of cream was not innocent. Still, she carried the weight of silence, knowing that if she voiced her theory, she would be dismissed again. Her throat ached with the burden of unspoken truth. At home later that night, Clara pulled an old textbook from her shelf, its spine cracked from years of use long ago. She flipped through the section on toxicology, her fingers trembling as she found the chapter on heavy metals. There it was in black and white. Thallium, colorless, tasteless, often absorbed through the skin. Symptoms including alopecia, neuropathy, organ failure, gastrointestinal distress, and a progression that matched Caldwell's decline exactly. She pressed her hand to the page, whispering, "This is it." Yet doubt gnawed at her. What good was her knowledge without authority? Would anyone take her seriously? Could she risk her job, the income her children depended on, the fragile stability she had built after years of sacrifice? She closed the book slowly, staring at her reflection in the window. Her children deserved a roof over their heads, but a man's life hung in the balance. She had once dreamed of saving lives through science, and now fate had placed her in a position where she might do just that. But it would cost her everything if she was wrong, or even if she was right but unheard. Back at the hospital the following night, Clara's resolve hardened. She entered Caldwell's suite during the night shift, when the room was quieter, fewer eyes present. She watched the jar on the nightstand, still prominent, still waiting to be used. Caldwell moaned faintly in his sleep, his breathing shallow, his decline unmistakable. Clara reached for her rag, dusting the counter near the cream, her movements casual, but her eyes sharp. She saw the faint metallic sheen on its surface again, remembered the faint odor, and her suspicions became certainty. The cream was killing him. The hand that had once built an empire now trembled weakly on the sheets, and Clara felt the injustice boil within her. Clara pushed her cleaning cart into the suite once again, her heart pounding as she saw the jar gleaming in its same prominent place. Caldwell lay weaker than before, his breathing labored, his lips pale, his hands trembling faintly on the sheets. Machines kept him alive but could not stop the progression of what was tearing him apart from within. The doctors gathered in their morning huddle. Dr. Hargrove at the center, his silver hair and calm authority filling the room as he dismissed theories and commanded silence. "We are considering advanced autoimmune disorders," he declared, his tone heavy with finality. "Our next course of action will be broad-spectrum immunosuppressants. Time is critical." The younger physicians nodded, their eyes flickering with uncertainty, but none daring to contradict him. Clara stood nearby, wiping the counter, her rag moving in circles though her focus was on their words. She knew immunosuppressants would not only fail but might accelerate Caldwell's decline. He was being poisoned, and every hour wasted on the wrong treatment pushed him closer to death. Her mouth went dry, her chest tightening. She told herself she had to try, she had to say something, even if they mocked her. As the doctors dispersed, she caught the attention of a night nurse she had spoken with before. "Excuse me," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her stomach. "Has anyone considered testing Mr. Caldwell for thallium poisoning? His symptoms match perfectly." For a brief second, the nurse looked surprised, but then her expression hardened into the familiar mask of dismissal. "Angela, I know you mean well," she said, deliberately misnaming Clara, not caring enough to remember, "but these are the top specialists in the country. Please don't involve yourself in medical matters." Clara tried to continue, "But the alopecia, the neuropathy, the digestive decline?" The nurse cut her off sharply. "If you're done eavesdropping, the bathroom needs cleaning. Leave the medicine to the doctors." The sting was immediate, like a slap. Clara felt her cheeks burn, the shame of invisibility pressed upon her once again, reducing her to the uniform she wore and nothing more. She nodded silently, stepping back, returning to her cart. But inside her mind, the certainty only grew stronger. They could dismiss her words, they could push her back into the shadows, but the truth remained. Caldwell was dying of thallium poisoning. She resumed her duties mechanically, emptying trash, scrubbing surfaces, her body moving through the motions while her mind raced. She thought of her children at home, depending on her income, depending on her stability. If she pushed too hard, if she crossed the invisible line, she could lose everything. But what did that matter if she let a man die, knowing she could have prevented it? The conflict tore at her with every step. the weight of invisibility pressing against the weight of responsibility. Later that afternoon, she overheard the doctors again outside the suite. "His decline is inconsistent," one said, frustration sharp in his tone. "Some days worse, some days better. It doesn't fit autoimmune." Hargrove silenced him with a glare. "Stick to the data. We proceed with immunosuppressants." Clara pressed her back against the wall, unseen as always, but her fists clenched around the handle of her cart. They were blind, bound by hierarchy and arrogance, unwilling to consider what was in front of them. She knew she had to do more. That evening in the employee restroom, she stared at her reflection. The uniform hung loosely on her tired frame, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but still sharp, still alive with knowledge. "They don't see me," she whispered. "But I see everything." She remembered her professor's voice, warning that thallium was called the perfect poison because doctors rarely thought to test for it unless someone forced them to look. She had promised herself that if words would not work, she would find evidence, proof undeniable enough that even Dr. Hargrove could not dismiss it. As she pushed her cart down the corridor, she felt like she was walking into battle, though her only weapons were her mind, her determination, and the forgotten fragments of her chemistry training. Caldwell's suite was dim, the soft lighting doing little to disguise the gravity of his decline. His breathing rasped faintly. His skin stretched pale over fragile bones, his once commanding presence reduced to the helpless shiver of a body breaking down. The nurses moved quietly around him, adjusting machines, whispering updates, but Clara's eyes fixed immediately on the elegant black jar still sitting on the nightstand, positioned deliberately as always, gleaming with false innocence. She had seen it too many times, seen how Whitman's visits always brought a new jar, seen how symptoms escalated afterward, and tonight she decided she would no longer just observe. Tonight she would act. She waited until a shift change created a small window of opportunity. For a few brief minutes, the suite was momentarily unattended, the nurses stepping out to hand off updates to the next team, the hallway unusually quiet. Clara moved quickly, her years of routine masking the urgency in her steps. She reached into her cart where she had hidden a sterile specimen container borrowed discreetly from the supply room earlier that evening. With practiced precision, she dipped her rag near the rim of the jar and transferred a small amount of cream into the container, her hand steady though her pulse thundered. She sealed it tightly and slipped it into her uniform pocket, the weight of it pressing against her side like both a burden and a promise. By the time the nurses returned, Clara was calmly wiping the counter, her face expressionless, her cart in its usual place, as though nothing had changed, but inside her chest a storm raged. She had just crossed a line, a dangerous line, the kind of line that could cost her the job that paid for her children's meals and rent. Yet the thought of Caldwell gasping for breath behind her made her feel that the risk was necessary. She left the suite quietly, the specimen container still in her pocket, and made her way to the maintenance closet on the lower floor. It was a small, cramped room filled with cleaning supplies and mops, a place no one would think twice about her entering. She shut the door behind her, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out the items she had smuggled together for this moment. Baking soda, aluminum foil, vinegar, small containers borrowed from the cafeteria. Crude tools, not the gleaming instruments of a professional laboratory, but she remembered enough to know they could be used to create a rudimentary test for heavy metals. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness as she recreated the method from memory, mixing solutions with the precision she had once practiced in university labs. She whispered steps to herself as if reciting a prayer, adding a small amount of the cream, adjusting the mixture, waiting for the reaction. Then it happened, the subtle but unmistakable color change that confirmed the presence of thallium ions. Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. It was real. She had been right all along. Richard Caldwell was not dying from a mysterious autoimmune disorder or rare disease. He was being poisoned, deliberately, systematically, and the jar of cream was the delivery system. For a moment she stood frozen in the maintenance closet, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, the sound of her own breathing loud in the silence. 20 doctors had failed, but a janitor in a uniform had uncovered the answer. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos of the test results, her heart racing. She knew this was not official, not lab certified, but it was something. It was evidence, and it meant she had a responsibility greater than her fear. She cleaned up quickly, erasing all signs of her experiment, returning supplies to their places, her mind already racing through possibilities. She could slip a note again to Dr. Hargrove, but he had mocked her before. She could approach one of the younger physicians like Dr. Chen, who had at least looked startled rather than contemptuous. But would they listen now? Would they believe her if she presented photos from a makeshift test performed in a maintenance closet? She thought of her children as she walked back through the hospital, her daughter Tasha's sharp eyes, her son Marcus's quiet worry. They depended on her paycheck, depended on her stability. If she pushed too hard, if she was accused of interfering again, security could escort her out and she might never find work in a hospital again. But then she thought of Richard Caldwell gasping in his bed, dying one breath at a time, and she felt the weight of moral responsibility crush the weight of fear. She whispered to herself, "What's the use of protecting my job if I let a man die when I know the truth?" That night, when her shift ended and she returned home, she sat at the kitchen table long after her children had gone to bed. The specimen container was gone, flushed away after the test, but the photos remained on her phone, glowing back at her like a haunting. She pulled out her old toxicology textbook again, cross-referencing symptoms, highlighting passages, scribbling notes. Every detail matched, every symptom aligned. She began to build a timeline, matching Caldwell's decline to Whitman's visits and the jars of cream, each one a nail in the coffin that she now understood had been built deliberately. Caldwell was being murdered slowly, deliberately, and no one in authority would admit it. Clara's phone carried the photos she had taken of her crude chemical test. Her notes outlined symptoms and timelines. Her old toxicology textbook reinforced every conclusion. But evidence in her hands meant nothing unless someone in power would finally listen. As she pushed her cart toward the suite, she whispered to herself that tonight she would no longer stay silent. Tonight she would place the truth where even arrogance could not ignore it. Inside Caldwell's suite, the tension was thicker than usual. Caldwell had deteriorated badly overnight. His skin looked waxen, his breathing uneven, and his responses delayed. Nurses adjusted machines with hurried hands, and Dr. Hargrove stood at the center of the storm, his face composed, but his tone sharp. "We must act quickly," he commanded, reviewing charts with the younger specialists. "His organ functions are collapsing. Increase immunosuppressants and begin preparing for neurological intervention." Clara felt fury rise in her chest. Immunosuppressants again. They were not only failing but making him weaker. She could not stay quiet. She moved forward, her rag still in her hand, her eyes locked on the chief physician. "Dr. Hargrove," she said clearly, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "He's not suffering from autoimmune disease. He's being poisoned. His symptoms match thallium exposure perfectly. The cream on his nightstand is the source. I tested it myself." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, 20 pairs of eyes turning toward the black janitor who dared to speak in a room full of specialists. "Dr. Hargrove's face darkened with irritation, his authority challenged by someone he considered invisible. "This is a closed medical conference," he snapped. "Security will escort you out if you continue to interfere." Clara did not flinch. She stepped closer, placing her notes and printed pages from her textbook onto the table where the doctors had gathered. "Peripheral neuropathy," she said firmly. "Distinctive hair loss, abdominal pain, cognitive decline. All progressing in a pattern that is textbook thallium. And yesterday I confirmed it with a chemical test. The cream Whitman brings is laced with it. Each application delivers another dose." She laid down her photos, the crude but unmistakable results glowing on the phone screen. "This is the proof." Hargrove's voice grew colder. "You are a janitor. You are not qualified to diagnose, much less conduct chemical testing." His words dripped with disdain, but Clara held his gaze. "I was a chemistry honors student at university. I studied toxicology before life forced me away. I know exactly what I saw. And I know that if you continue down your current path, this man will be dead before the week ends." The younger doctors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from her notes to Caldwell's fragile body. One of them, Dr. Chen, spoke tentatively. "Her description does match the progression we've seen. The hair loss, the neuropathy, the gastrointestinal issues, they don't align with autoimmune, but they do align with heavy metal poisoning." Hargrove glared at him, but another Dr. Park leaned forward and said, "If thallium is being introduced gradually, our standard heavy metal panels might not have detected it. We could run a specific test now." Silence filled the room as the hierarchy cracked. Clara's chest heaved, but she held steady, forcing them to look at the truth. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "You expect us to believe you performed a reliable test in a broom closet?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Sodium rhodocyanate reaction. Modified for limited resources. The color change is unmistakable. Any trained toxicologist would recognize it. Run the test properly, and you'll see I'm right." For the first time, Hargrove hesitated. His authority could not erase the evidence in front of him, not when his younger colleagues began nodding slowly, their faces filled with reluctant recognition. Dr. Winters, the toxicology specialist, leaned down to study her photos more closely. "That is indeed the reaction we'd expect," he admitted reluctantly. The room buzzed with murmurs as the younger physicians pressed for action. Dr. Park finally said, "We should run a targeted test immediately. If she's right, we need Prussian blue treatment at once." Hargrove's authority faltered, but even he could not stop the momentum now. He waved a hand sharply, his voice tight. "Fine, run the test. But if this is a distraction, we waste critical time." Nurses rushed to collect samples, drawing Caldwell's blood, collecting hair strands, and carefully sealing the jar of cream for official toxicology. Clara stood quietly, her chest tight, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had forced them to act. She had pierced the wall of invisibility with sheer determination. Minutes later, the toxicology lab confirmed elevated thallium levels, levels that matched cumulative exposure. The room erupted in chaos. Orders flew, nurses hurried to administer Prussian blue, specialists recalibrated their strategies, and Hargrove stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, realization, and reluctant acknowledgement. Thallium was present in Caldwell's bloodstream at significant levels, its unmistakable chemical fingerprint spread across the samples of blood, hair, and the expensive jar of imported hand cream that had been so carefully placed on his nightstand. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Nurses rushing to administer Prussian blue, specialists arguing over dosage adjustments, and younger doctors exchanging glances that said everything their voices dared not. The janitor had been right. Clara stood silently near the wall, her uniform making her look like an outsider even as her knowledge had just saved a man's life. She watched as Caldwell's monitors flickered, his vitals beginning to stabilize after days of steady decline, proof that her desperate gamble had been worth it. Yet even in that moment of vindication, she knew the battle was not over, because the poisoning had not been an accident. Someone had deliberately fed Caldwell death disguised as comfort, and the man responsible still walked free. The security team, spurred by her insistence, pulled surveillance footage of recent visits. The screen showed Henry Whitman entering Caldwell's suite again and again, each time carrying the same elegant jar, each time lingering just long enough to tamper with it before placing it prominently for the nurses to use. The evidence was damning. Within hours, the FBI was contacted, their agents arriving with brisk efficiency, their presence transforming the luxurious wing into a crime scene. Clara felt a strange mix of triumph and unease as she watched Whitman escorted into custody. Triumph because the truth had been dragged into the light, unease because she knew how easily her role in uncovering it could be rewritten, dismissed, or erased by those unwilling to acknowledge that a black janitor had outsmarted 20 doctors and exposed a murderer. "Doctor?" Hargrove's face betrayed the struggle between pride and humiliation as he addressed the room. "If you're correct," he muttered, glancing at Clara's notes again, "our treatments may have accelerated his decline. Chelation therapy for mercury would have been useless against thallium." Clara answered softly but firmly, "Yes, you were treating symptoms created by the poison itself. Every wrong assumption gave it more time to work. The silence that followed was heavy. No one wanted to admit that their arrogance had nearly killed the most powerful patient in the hospital, but the evidence could not be denied. Clara's photos, her notes, her explanation of the sodium rhodocyanate test she had improvised in a maintenance closet, all of it was validated now by official labs and life-saving treatment. The younger doctors began asking her questions, their voices respectful in ways she had never experienced from medical professionals. "How did you spot the pattern?" one asked. "Why didn't we see it?" Another added. Clara answered plainly, "Because you weren't looking for it. You were looking for diseases that fit your assumptions. I was looking at the patient. His symptoms were textbook if you knew what to look for." She explained the connection between alopecia, neuropathy, organ decline, and the timing of Whitman's visits. She laid out her reasoning with the clarity of someone who had lived with invisibility long enough to know that precision was the only weapon against dismissal. For the first time, they listened. For the first time, her uniform did not erase her mind. Dr. Winters, the toxicology specialist, studied her makeshift test results with reluctant respect. Sodium rhodocyanate, he repeated. That's advanced methodology, rarely used outside specialized labs. Clara nodded. I learned it at university, Professor Harrison's toxicology seminar. I never forgot it. Recognition flickered in several faces at the mention of Harrison, a legend in the field. You were his student? Dr. Park asked, curiosity replacing skepticism. For one semester, Clara admitted, her voice carrying the quiet weight of regret. Before life forced me to leave. The doctors fell silent again, and Clara could see the realization settling over them. They had mocked her, dismissed her, threatened her job, yet she had saved their patient with knowledge they had overlooked. The hierarchy had cracked, and through the fracture her truth had forced its way in. As Caldwell's vitals steadied further, Dr. Park ordered new focused tests to track the progression of thallium in his system, while nurses prepared more doses of Prussian blue. The energy in the room shifted from despair to determined hope. Even Hargrove could not deny it any longer. He turned toward Clara, his tall frame seeming less imposing now, his voice strained as he said, "Your intervention was correct." The words came awkwardly, dragged out of him by necessity, but they were words Clara had never expected to hear from a man like him. She nodded once, professional, though inside her chest the validation burned bright. But the moment was not about her pride. It was about the man lying in the bed, slowly coming back from the edge of death because she had refused to stay silent. Hours later, as agents interviewed staff and secured evidence, Clara remained in the background, watching quietly. She saw Caldwell stir for the first time in days, his eyes fluttering open weakly. The doctors hushed, the room holding its breath as the billionaire whispered hoarsely, "What happened?" Hargrove hesitated, a moment of choice flickering across his face, claim credit or speak truth. He straightened, then said, "You were being poisoned with thallium, Mr. Caldwell. We missed it, all of us. It was Miss Johnson who discovered it." Every head turned toward Clara. Caldwell's eyes found her, weak but steady, and he whispered, "Thank you for seeing what they missed." The words hit her harder than she expected, breaking through years of invisibility. She bowed her head slightly, her composure intact, but her heart thundered. Around her, the doctors began to applaud, starting with Dr. Park, then spreading until the sound filled the suite. Clara stood taller than she had in years, her uniform unchanged, but her status transformed. The FBI had taken Henry Whitman into custody. Security footage had confirmed his careful manipulation of the cream, and official toxicology had validated her theory beyond dispute. But Clara knew recognition could be a double-edged sword. For the first time in her life, people in positions of power were looking at her not as the black janitor who mopped their floors, but as the woman who had seen what 20 doctors missed, and that visibility felt as heavy as invisibility ever had. Inside the suite, Caldwell's vitals improved hour by hour. Nurses adjusted the monitors with renewed optimism, and for the first time since his admission, there was talk of recovery instead of decline. Clara lingered near the doorway, listening as the younger physicians discussed treatment protocols, their voices filled with respect whenever they glanced in her direction. Dr. Park in particular made no effort to hide his admiration. "Without her, we would still be guessing," he said plainly, his words carrying through the room. "We owe her our patient's life." The statement made Clara's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Pride because her knowledge had finally broken through the wall of dismissal. Disbelief because for years, those same halls had treated her like background noise. When Dr. Hargrove finally approached her, his tall frame casting a long shadow, Clara braced herself. His expression was stiff, his jaw clenched, but his eyes no longer carried only contempt. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice measured as though each word weighed more than he wanted to admit, "I owe you an apology. Your diagnosis was correct, and without it we would have lost Mr. Caldwell. I underestimated you." Clara met his gaze calmly, her face neutral, though her pulse raced. "You didn't see me," she said quietly, "but I saw everything." The words hung between them like a quiet rebuke, undeniable in their truth. Hargrove gave a small nod, acknowledging more with silence than he ever could with words. Hours later, Caldwell regained full consciousness, his eyes opening weakly, his voice hoarse but steady as he asked for water. When he looked around the room and his gaze settled on Clara, he whispered, "They told me. You saved my life." The billionaire's gratitude felt surreal, his frail hand reaching slightly toward her as though she were the most important figure in the room. Clara stepped forward only enough to nod respectfully, her composure intact despite the weight of the moment. "I just noticed what others missed," she said softly. "That's all." But to Caldwell, it was everything. Word of her intervention spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses who once ignored her now nodded as she passed. Doctors who never made eye contact now paused to acknowledge her presence, and staff whispered in corridors, "That's her, the janitor who outsmarted 20 doctors." The shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. Clara, who had walked the halls for years as if invisible, now moved through them under a spotlight she had never asked for. At home that evening, her children noticed the difference in her posture. Tasha, perceptive at 14, asked cautiously, "Mom, are things changing at work?" Clara hesitated before answering, "Yes, something has shifted." She explained in simple terms that she had recognized what others overlooked, that people were listening now, but she warned her daughter not to expect the world to transform overnight. "Respect isn't given permanently," she said. "It's earned and maintained, and even then, some people will always resist giving it. But yes, things are different." Marcus, her 12-year-old son, looked at her with wide eyes. "You saved a man's life, didn't you?" Clara smiled faintly. "I did what I could when no one else saw the truth." At the hospital, administrators were unsure how to handle her sudden rise from invisibility. On one hand, her role as a janitor was fixed by employment records and pay grades. On the other hand, her contribution had become impossible to ignore. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, the hospital's chief of medicine, summoned Clara into her office. The meeting room was spacious, walls lined with accolades, and Clara felt the contrast between that world and her own uniform sharply. Matthews spoke with careful diplomacy. "Miss Johnson, your actions have placed this institution in an unusual position. You demonstrated exceptional medical knowledge while employed in a non-medical role. The board has authorized a commendation and a bonus, and we would like to discuss opportunities that might better utilize your background." Clara listened politely, understanding the delicate balance Matthews was trying to strike. Recognition without fully admitting the systemic failure that had led to her dismissal in the first place. She accepted the commendation gracefully but remained grounded. "I value learning," she said evenly. "Even when circumstances kept me from finishing my education, I never stopped learning." Matthews nodded, relieved by her calm response. Outside the hospital walls, the story began to leak, reporters catching wind of the dramatic tale of a janitor who had saved a billionaire when 20 doctors failed. Security worked to keep cameras away, but whispers grew into headlines. Clara avoided the spotlight, uninterested in fame, but she could not stop the story from spreading. 1 week after Caldwell's recovery began, she received an unexpected summons to his downtown office. Dressed in her best clothes, not a uniform but modest attire that carried dignity, she entered the gleaming skyscraper of Caldwell Innovations. The executive floor felt like another planet, polished and quiet, filled with the weight of wealth and power. Caldwell, thinner but alive, rose from behind his desk to greet her personally. "Miss Johnson," he said warmly, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you properly. I am alive because you saw what others missed." He gestured for her to sit, reversing the roles entirely, he, the billionaire, offering a chair to her, the janitor. Clara sat cautiously, her posture respectful but her confidence unshaken. Caldwell studied her carefully. "Dr. Hargrove explained your background. You were a chemistry prodigy, a scholarship student. Life took you away from it, but your mind never stopped working. That is why you saw what they missed." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was documentation for a scholarship created in her name, a full stipend to complete her chemistry degree, childcare included, and guaranteed placement in the toxicology department at Johns Hopkins once she graduated. Clara's breath caught. For a moment she could only stare, her fingers brushing the edges of the papers. Caldwell continued, "This is not charity. This is an investment in talent too valuable to waste. The hospital has already approved your transition. You belong in the lab, not behind a mop." Tears pricked her eyes, but she steadied her voice. "My children, they will be provided for," Caldwell interrupted. She had walked past these same doors years earlier as a scholarship student filled with ambition, and now she returned as a mother of two, a former janitor, a survivor of humiliation, and the woman who had saved one of the wealthiest men in America. Her children's proud faces the night before replayed in her mind as she stepped inside, her daughter Tasha whispering, "Dr. Mom," with a smile, her son Marcus clapping his hands with a joy that made every sacrifice worth it. Clara had accepted Caldwell's offer, not out of vanity but out of obligation to the truth she carried, the truth that knowledge unrecognized still mattered, the truth that brilliance existed even in those society pushed to the margins. The hospital had made her transition official, assigning her part-time duties in the toxicology department while she resumed her studies full-time, and though the halls still buzzed with whispers of the janitor who outsmarted 20 doctors, she walked with her head high. Each lecture felt like both a homecoming and a challenge. Years of working night shifts and raising children had dulled none of her intellect, but had left gaps in theory and terminology that she now had to rebuild. Professors raised eyebrows at her age, classmates looked at her curiously, but when she answered questions, her words carried the clarity of someone who had lived the stakes, someone who had connected theory to human survival. Her advanced chemical analysis professor remarked after one lab session, "You approach problems differently. You see applications before theories." Clara replied quietly, "I learned in reverse order. Practice before principle." In the hospital lab, she earned the same respect from technicians and doctors who had once overlooked her. She solved problems others missed, spotting patterns buried in data, connecting symptoms scattered across charts. Cases that had baffled teams were suddenly clearer when Clara traced the overlooked detail, the faint odor in a sample, the small inconsistency in a timeline. Dr. Park became her strongest advocate, often reminding colleagues, "She saved Caldwell. She sees what we don't." His support became a shield against the lingering discomfort of others like Dr. Hargrove, who now nodded stiffly when passing her in corridors, his pride still bruised but his silence proof that he could no longer dismiss her. The press continued to chase her, stories appearing under headlines like "Janitor saves billionaire" and "Invisible worker becomes hero," but Clara avoided interviews, choosing instead to focus on her studies and her children. At home, the atmosphere shifted. The kitchen table that once held budget sheets and cleaning schedules now held textbooks, lab reports, and college applications. Tasha's grades soared, inspired by her mother's journey, while Marcus began talking about science projects with excitement. They were not just watching their mother reclaim her path, they were stepping onto their own. One evening, Tasha asked, "Do you think people will respect you now, Mom?" Clara smiled gently. "Respect isn't permanent. It's something you earn and maintain." But yes, something has shifted. A month into her new routine, Caldwell invited her back to his office, this time not to thank her, but to show her the progress of a foundation he had created in her name. The Beaumont Scholarship for Scientific Excellence, named after Clara's mother's maiden name to honor her family's history, would provide full funding for individuals whose education had been interrupted by hardship. The first recipients included a delivery driver with a gift for mathematics, a retail worker with a passion for biology, and a landscaper with remarkable skills in environmental chemistry. As Caldwell announced it at a small ceremony, he looked at Clara and said, "She is proof that brilliance exists everywhere, not just in credentialed spaces. The world nearly lost me because the system ignored her, and I will not let that lesson go to waste." Clara stood before the audience, humbled and proud, her children watching from the front row, her heart swelling at the thought that her journey could open doors for others still trapped in invisibility. The media wrote about the scholarship, about the billionaire saved by the janitor who became a toxicologist, but Clara kept her focus on the work. She knew recognition could fade, applause could die out, but the chance to finish her degree and contribute to science was real and permanent. In her quiet moments, she still wrestled with self-doubt, the echo of years of dismissal whispering in her mind, but each solved case, each passed exam, each moment of her children's pride chipped away at the old wounds. She carried her uniform folded neatly in her closet, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of the strength she had forged through invisibility. One afternoon, while reviewing samples in the lab, Clara found herself standing beside Dr. Winters, the toxicology specialist who had once dismissed her. He studied her work for a moment and finally admitted, "Your eye for detail is sharper than most of the fellows here." "You caught what I didn't." Clara looked at him calmly and replied, "Sometimes it takes someone who's been overlooked to see what others overlook." The words hung in the air, a quiet truth he could not deny. At home that evening, Clara explained to her children that life had no straight paths, only winding ones. "My path wasn't what I planned," she told them, "but it taught me to observe, to persist, to find worth in myself even when others didn't. That's what matters." Marcus looked at her with admiration. "You're going to be a doctor, Mom," Clara smiled. At 40 years old, she was older than most of her classmates, her path littered with detours and setbacks, but as she held the certificate in her hands, she felt no regret for the years lost. Every moment of invisibility, every dismissal, every night spent cleaning floors when she wanted to be analyzing compounds had shaped the woman who now walked across the stage with her head held high. Her classmates cheered, professors nodded, and her children clapped until their hands ached. For Clara, it was not simply a piece of paper. It was proof that perseverance could overcome invisibility, proof that her brilliance could not be buried forever, proof that the world could no longer ignore her. That summer, she began her official role in the toxicology department at Johns Hopkins, the very institution that had once taught her and then lost her to tragedy. She stood in laboratories filled with gleaming equipment she once only dusted, now hers to command. Her colleagues quickly learned what the doctors at Street Marks had discovered too late. Clara had an uncanny ability to see patterns others overlooked. When puzzling cases arrived, when lab results conflicted, when symptoms refused to align neatly, it was often Clara who found the thread that tied everything together. Her years of invisibility had honed her observation, her persistence had sharpened her logic, and her journey had given her the humility to look where others refused. Reporters occasionally resurfaced her story, publishing features titled "From Mop to Microscope" or "The Janitor Who Saved a Tycoon," but Clara never chased attention. She turned down television appearances, politely declined when asked to be the subject of documentaries. What mattered to her was not the fame but the work, the lives she could save, the students she could mentor, and the examples she could set for her children and for every unseen worker still walking the halls of hospitals across the country. The Beaumont Scholarship, funded by Richard Caldwell and expanded by other donors, began to change lives as well. Former delivery drivers, waitresses, and factory workers who had shown scientific promise but been forced to abandon their studies now had the chance to return, and Clara made it her mission to personally meet each recipient. She told them the same words again and again: "You are not defined by the uniform you wear or the job you hold today. Your worth is in your mind, and the world needs to see it." Her story became a beacon in ways she never anticipated, her name whispered in classrooms as proof that brilliance could come from anywhere. Yet Clara never let herself forget the past. She kept her old janitor's uniform framed in her office, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a testament to the strength born from invisibility. Whenever students or colleagues asked why she displayed it, she answered simply, "Because it taught me how to see what others miss." Richard Caldwell, recovered and still at the helm of his empire, though thinner and slower than before, remained in touch with her. He often said in interviews that his life had been saved not by the brilliance of 20 doctors, but by the courage of one black woman society had trained itself to ignore. "She taught me," he once told a reporter, "that money and power mean nothing if you cannot recognize the wisdom standing right in front of you." His words spread widely, but to Clara, the greater victory was not in his praise, but in her ability to walk into her lab each morning, knowing she belonged. 1 year after her graduation, Clara was invited to deliver the keynote speech at a hospital conference on diagnostic innovation. Standing at the podium in front of hundreds of physicians, she began with quiet words that silenced the room. "Observation does not require credentials," she said. "Sometimes the most valuable insights come from people trained to be invisible, from those who see patterns precisely because they move through the world differently. Brilliance is not confined to framed degrees. It exists in every hallway, in every overlooked worker, waiting for the chance to be seen." She spoke not with bitterness but with conviction, her voice carrying the weight of truth that could not be denied. Among the audience sat Dr. Hargrove, his face older, his pride tempered by the memory of how close he had come to losing his patient. He nodded slowly as she spoke, professional enough to acknowledge that the woman he had once dismissed now stood on the stage as his equal, perhaps his superior. When the applause thundered through the hall at the end of her speech, Clara bowed her head slightly, her heart swelling with gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. That evening, she returned home to find Tasha studying for her own college entrance exams, inspired to pursue medicine, and Marcus working on a science project with the same meticulous care his mother once showed in university labs. Her children had grown up watching her rise from invisibility, and they carried her resilience into their own futures. Clara sat with them at the kitchen table, the same table that once held bills and cleaning schedules, now covered with textbooks and scientific journals. She told them, "Your worth isn't determined by how others see you. It exists whether they recognize it or not. The world may ignore you, laugh at you, dismiss you, but you carry truth inside you. And when the time comes, you must be brave enough to show it." 2 years later, as she walked across the stage again, this time not as a student, but as a speaker at the ceremony inaugurating the Beaumont Research Center for Toxicology, she thought of every step it had taken to arrive at this moment. The years of invisibility, the night she whispered, "I see everything" to herself in a bathroom mirror, the makeshift test in a maintenance closet, the confrontation with 20 doctors, the applause in Caldwell's suite, all of it had been leading here. The end. If this story held your attention, I would love for you to support more stories like it by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps bring forward more narratives where overlooked voices finally get their recognition. Tell me in the comments what you thought of Clara's journey from being dismissed to being respected, and whether you think the doctors learned their lesson. I'm also curious where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments so we can see how far this story travels.